Griffin. Um, Hi, everyone. Welcome to this workshop on grounding improvements to the UI system and the lived experiences of jobless workers. I am Francisco Diaz, and I am the Worker Justice Policy Advocate with Center for Popular Democracy and Unemployed Action, which is a project of Center for Popular Democracy. And we're working with a lot of unemployed workers around the country. And we're fortunate enough to have two fantastic member leaders, Courtney Henley and Lois Prue, who have been doing amazing work in kind of grounding our own work in their own lived experiences and helping us fight for access in different ways, whether it's kind of in our community maintenance or in direct advocacy in different ways or policy input. So I'm going to quickly go over a quick agenda. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of the flaws in the UI system. I realize folks here might be experts, and I hope to not touch too deeply on any of these, but they kind of give a sense of kind of the wide breadth of the deeply broken UI system that we currently have, and how that's embedded in kind of history. And we'll have Lois and Courtney kind of discuss their own personal experiences with their own difficulties with access. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of including worker voices and worker input in the process of organizing for a movement to not just kind of get relief now, unemployment relief now, but also unemployment reform. And we'll open up for Q&As, but if you have any questions kind of during my presentation, or at any point, I think we're in a small enough casual group that you can just kind of unmute yourself or bring up your question or put it in the chat however you want to. So I just want to start off by kind of highlighting that the unemployment insurance system was a system built on racial domination from the very beginning. We know this kind of we can trace this all the way to the language of the Emancipation Proclamation and its language against idleness. And we know that in the 1930s, the actual legislation that got passed as a part of the Social Security Act was a compromise between Northern and Southern Democrats, where Southern Democrats wanted to keep Black workers in poverty, whereas Northern Democrats wanted more generous programs. And their base was a multiracial working class based in northern cities. And they wanted to give individual states the capacity to administer their own UI programs with all the problems that could entail. So who's included in our safety net as it exists now? The New Deal eligibility issues still persist today. So they excluded agricultural and domestic workers, but the exclusions left behind half of all Black men, half of all Mexican men, half of all Native American men and women, and 90% of Black women. And systemic inequities based in those exclusions and eligibility still exist today and have been made more stark by the failed response to the pandemic. Most notably, I think it's worth bringing up kind of the very sizable group of independent contractors and self-employed individuals who had to join through PUA and have to depend on PUA today, and that was totally, still to this day, is formally not a part of unemployment insurance in any sort of permanent sense. And again, it's kind of designed for the full-time salaried employee with a spouse at home. So there are people who are categorically excluded, as mentioned before, self-employed individuals, undocumented migrants, seasonal and temporary workers, and then people who make earnings that their earnings before their layoff have to be higher than a basic minimum threshold, and that includes people with part-time unstable work or who are parenting or due to illness, or potentially completely new individuals who are new to the labor market entirely, such as students, for example, who are also excluded from being eligible for any sort of unemployment benefit. And currently, job separation has to be involuntary or for good cause. People are fired for absences, even when caused by transportation failure. Workers on strike are not eligible for UI. Parents who have to quit or care for a child or elderly parent are not necessarily eligible for UI. The claimant has to search for full-time work. And so that excludes people who can only work part-time. And it's worth kind of pointing out that the vast majority of unemployed workers in the United States don't receive any benefits. And that was even true during various parts of the pandemic, during the current pandemic emergency. And that might be for a variety of reasons, such as the lags in benefits because of political inaction and foot dragging and negotiations. That has come at the cost of millions of workers. But we know that this is the case because of narrow eligibility. There's a big burden on the worker to apply inaccessible systems that discourage people from claiming benefits. Whether that's the way the form is constructed or who helps them out. And there's a strong emphasis on preventing fraud over delivery benefits. And it's worth highlighting the persistent racism in the labor markets. Unemployment, the unemployment rate for Black workers is typically double the rate of for white workers, and for the unemployment rate for all Black workers is higher than the unemployment rate for white high school dropouts. So just kind of keeping that in mind is critical to understanding kind of where our potential visions for reforming UI have to be grounded in thinking through kind of what might be a better system than the one we currently have. And who applies for UI? These folks tend to be upper middle class, professional middle class, higher income individuals, folks who have higher levels of education. But one of the things that seems to be interesting is that unions seem to make a big difference in both the application rates and the recipiency rates of workers who are able to access unemployment insurance benefits. And so we can see here that we see big racial disparities in recipiency and access during the Great Recession in 2010. And we can also see that those racial disparities still exist today. And this is a much more recent graph from, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, where we see big disparities between white non-Hispanics, Black Americans, and Hispanic Americans, or Hispanic workers, Black workers. And one of the things that I think is worth pointing out very explicitly, at least from our perspective collectively, I would say is that reforming UI is kind of critical in the fight for racial justice. Compared to white people, workers of color are more likely to be unemployed, significantly less likely to apply for UI when they lose income. And when they do apply for UI, they're less likely to receive benefits. During the pandemic, white unemployed workers have been more likely to receive unemployment benefits than workers of color. And tied to that is that workers need to have a say in the unemployment insurance system. Currently, there's no formal mechanism to include workers' voices or to embed kind of interest groups that represent workers, like unions or community organizations, into the systems. We know that the most successful UI systems in the world build this through labor union administration or participation in the system as systems navigators or as direct administrators of what are called Ghent funds. And there's no way that currently exists directly in the system. And I just want to highlight kind of the inadequacy of benefits. When kind of prompted to think about this, a lot of the issues around access also come down to the fact that the benefits are often so paltry that the point of applying is taken away in a lot of cases, certainly without any sort of federal supplement that currently exists. UI benefits are insufficient to fulfill basic needs, especially for folks who are living paycheck to paycheck. And there's a huge variation among states in how much people receive and how long they can count on benefits. Here we get a sense of that variation across states. The maximum benefit the weekly maximum benefit amount that is available, varies from below $200 in Arizona to Maine or Mississippi and Maine, where the maximum benefit is $1,234 every week, and that's with dependents. And we also see that there is a correlation, obviously, between states that have low benefit amounts and the percentage of Black workers within that given state. We can see that many of the southern states in the former Confederacy follow a very common pattern we've seen in a lot of other kind of safety net issues, where we have let states decide for themselves how to administer benefits and their generosity. Again, the percentage of jobless residents who are in the South and who are Black is higher in the South, and southern states are more likely to kick workers off UI after a short amount of time. because the duration of benefits is much lower. I think I'm not going to go too deep into kind of the funding and federal incentives, but it's worth highlighting that kind of experience rating in the funding mechanisms for unemployment insurance incentivize employers to contest UI claims to minimize their higher taxes that are imposed on them through experience rating. And they have to and that part of the problem here is also that different states have started to compete with each other with regards to their level of unemployment insurance tax rates in order to try and create a supposedly favorable business climate for private employers. And that just and with that, there's strong incentives to cut UI benefits, especially as state trust funds run out in times of crisis, which is what happened after the Great Recession. And I also want to briefly highlight that there are widespread administrative failures kind of due to the fact that this is a state federal program. And there are over 50 different unemployment insurance programs across the country. It's deliberately difficult to process. It's a deliberately difficult process to engage with as a worker and difficult to understand. And there are, underfunded IT systems and overwhelmed UI staff. I know, for example, Kansas's UI system still uses COBOL from the 1970s. And, states are, and during this pandemic especially, we have seen that states are unable to process changes in the UI system that have been brought about through the CARES Act and the relief package that passed in December. And that's caused a number of lags at the cost of workers. And kind of with that, I want to invite kind of Courtney and Henley and Lois to kind of talk about their own kind of experience with access issues and kind of their own experience in who has been eligible and who hasn't been ineligible, if they want to speak up at all.
Sure. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the presentation, Francisco, because I also learned some things I didn't know but made sense for my own life.
Mm-hmm.
I face so much racism in hiring in my chosen fields of first TV and film production, and then media and marketing, that for the past 21 years, I've always had to be a freelancer and then self-employed. In those years, I've had numerous periods of unemployment where I fell into poverty and near homelessness because I couldn't apply for any type of unemployment. I'm sure that this is true for millions of Americans, especially people of color and older people. Thus, the pandemic ended up being good for us in this way, as it exposed the need for gig workers and the self-employed to be able to claim unemployment benefits. I would not have survived with my long hauling 10 months COVID bout had that not been provided. And so I feel that we need to ensure that even after the pandemic ends, that gig workers, freelancers, low wage workers, and the self-employed are able to gain unemployment when they need to, claim unemployment when they need to. And this would substantially help in ending poverty.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Courtney. And I think that really elucidates even more carefully in a way that I didn't even think about myself, about how that dynamic exists in the labor market itself, why folks end up searching for self-employment. So thank you. Lois, do you want to kind of discuss a little bit about your own experience?
Yeah, for me, I was a temporary part-time worker, and traditionally I would not have been eligible for any kind of unemployment. As a matter of fact, I'm eligible for the pandemic unemployment assistance and the federal pandemic unemployment compensation, but I'm not eligible for regular unemployment. If I had just been laid off and there was no pandemic, I would have had no money coming in. I'm fortunate that I live in Massachusetts, and overall things have gone smoothly for me. But there was one point, I think in April, where there was fraud people were somehow getting access to the accounts of people in Massachusetts that were on unemployment. And I'm not sure if my account was hacked, but just to be on the safe side, the state had to pretty much close everybody's accounts and have us refile our claims.
Mm-hmm.
And I could understand, why that was necessary, because otherwise we could have been giving our money to, perfect strangers. But so I had to reopen a claim, and so I was without money for a couple of weeks. Luckily in Massachusetts, we must now, either I'm fortunate or Massachusetts has an excellent computer system, because I was only without money for a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of July, when they stopped those $600 federal pandemic unemployment compensation payments, that extra money, my boyfriend and I got behind on our bills, because I was only getting the state unemployment of that was being taxed too, so we really couldn't pay bills. And then fast forward to December, when the benefits ended, and number 45 didn't sign that COVID relief package as soon as he should have. I lost my benefits. Now, fortunately, at least for me in Massachusetts, and I can't speak for other people in Massachusetts, but for me, the state quickly updated its computer system, and I was only without money for a week or two. People in other states with much more antiquated systems and much less compassionate politicians still haven't received their money. And even in Massachusetts, I go on the Massachusetts unemployment site, and there are people who are confused about if they should file their taxes, and it's just, I'm trying to think of answers to their questions, and I can't, because the problems are just so complicated. It's like you need a degree in, I don't know, astrophysics to understand the UI system.
I think that's a great way to put it, Lois, because I know we've had the fortune of working with a lot of lawyers who have been doing kind of legal aid services and help for a lot of workers. And I mean, this is true because I know so many of you, and Lois and Courtney, you're probably way more experts in how to navigate the system than I am. But I know that even for experienced kind of unemployment insurance, legal aid lawyers, that going through the system is extremely difficult and extremely confusing. And that's even and that includes in states where we supposedly say that we have a decent unemployment insurance system. And I think that's really worth highlighting.
It was really crazy here in New York because, for example, I had not applied for, gosh, I think it was like, I hadn't been eligible to even apply because the last day job I had was 2008. So I didn't even realize that I had an account. So there was this crazy thing where it was locking me out of the system, and then there was no way to get into it. And so fortunately, I found a Facebook group that kind of helped me figure that out. They gave me a secret number. But if I hadn't had that secret number of the actual IT guy for the Department of Labor in New York, I might never have gotten through. How the system is run with people having to call 500 times. I mean, at one point I called like 800 times in one day.
Jeez.
And you just had to just keep down and then it would hang up on you, and people never can really get through. And then I also was able, through that group, they gave out the governor's number. And again, Cuomo was great in that you could call his office and within 2 hours, they would make them call you back. So we were very lucky in our state, because I still know people in other states that are saying they haven't gotten unemployment at all yet.
Yeah.
Because they haven't figured it out.
And for me, trying to navigate the system, I feel intellectually impaired, and I guess it gives me some insight as to what it's like for people who do have that problem.
Mhm.
No, I think the system is designed that way, though. I feel like it's designed for, especially like Florida. I've heard horror stories because DeSantis didn't really want the people to get unemployment at all anyway. So
Yeah.
they've set it up in a way where people just can't get through and they get so frustrated. And then I think a lot of people give up. And that was the one thing I kept telling people is it has to become your full-time job till you get through. I mean, it literally took me 2 weeks. But then once I did get through, then I've had no problem since last May.
That makes sense. Wow.
Francisco, we have a question.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you want to Oh, there's Catherine.
Yeah. Hello.
Hey.
So I had a question.
Yeah.
Y'all know, when you were working, that you would or would not have been eligible for unemployment had you lost your job? Like, did you have any sense of it, that you were in a job that maybe wasn't ever going to get you unemployment unless the federal government did something special? Or did you just assume that you would or assume that you wouldn't before you actually lost your job?
Well, I actually have my own small business because, again, as I was saying, there was so much racism in hiring and PR and marketing, and I'm older now. And so I went from having to deal with racism to now I'm dealing with racism and I'm over 40. So between the two of those, I don't even try to interview for jobs anymore because it's just not a reality. So I started doing PR for small businesses myself about 6 years ago. And so it's very client based. So I'm constantly at trade shows and, that kind of thing, getting clients. So I had no idea what I was going to do because when I got it right at the beginning, I had COVID really badly back in March. And so I didn't even know that I would be eligible or what I was going to do for money. I was hoping I would get better and maybe try to transition to doing events online for clients or something. And it wasn't until the bill was actually passed and then people said that there was this PUA thing that I knew that I was eligible.
I know that for me, I was in a temporary job and I knew that I would not be eligible for unemployment should I be laid off. But I really needed a job, so I took the first thing that came along.
Thanks, Catherine. I know we have some other conference guests here. If you all have any questions, feel free to chime in the chat or to just talk about your work and how people at the Unemployed Action Center for Popular Democracy might be able to help support your work and to collaborate together on future projects. Yeah, Francisco, if you want to talk about the center a bit.
Yeah, and I can talk a little bit about kind of our perspective, which I think is one that we share, we hold pretty deeply, is like there are many reasons why we see kind of workers' voices as being central in any sort of reform effort or relief effort. Unemployed workers are experts themselves. They have discovered a lot of the problems we wouldn't pay attention to if we didn't listen. I think one of the big emphasis we've been engaging in a kind of policy development series recently that Lois has been a part of, where we've been trying to help develop kind of a platform and give feedback to a report that's being worked on a little bit on some ideas for unemployment insurance reform, but a lot of it is highlighting a lot of the major issues that we're reading about in the news, but also workers are constantly highlighting the issues with administration and the fact that there are such massive lags in so many different states kind of points to the need for either federal standards or federalization, and points to the need for different ways to be able to adequately address those needs pretty directly. We don't see, from the center's perspective and Unemployed Action's perspective, we won't win reform without input on any sort of platform, and we put forward, or if folks aren't involved in the organizing needed to win. And it has to be a comprehensive reform that can mobilize people, that can make people excited, right? Like, as Courtney has pointed out, there are so many people who are self-employed or have their own business, who would probably mobilize for a permanent reform that it included them in a way that you know, reforms on the edges or policy changes on the edges that don't actually change major categories of eligibility or benefit level. And, you know, I think one of the things that we always try and highlight, whether in the media or elsewhere, we need worker voices individually and collectively, because we're not going to, nothing ever changes historically. The unemployment insurance system, as flawed as it is, wasn't created on the backs of policy experts alone. It was created on the backs of unemployed and employed workers who struck like crazy in the 1930s to make it happen. And I think we're going to need mobilizations and major pressure coming from all of us in order to win. And, you know, nothing should be about folks without them, especially folks who are the most vulnerable and most affected by the crises we're all living through. Tom,
Thanks
do you want to?
so
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I see
June,
Tom. Sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead, Tom, and then
You
June
can moderate.
Hopkins has a question as well.
Cool.
Please unmute yourself, Tom, so we can hear you.
Sorry. So I'm from California, and for years was president of the California Labor Federation, and have worked on UI here since the 1980s, and still have some. Still try to help the Federation do something about the horrible system we have. I think federalization is really the only answer, and I actually would support full federalization, not just stronger federal regulation, because it's really been impossible to fix the system here. Our last benefit increase, I remember well because I negotiated it with the governor's office on 9/11. And the benefits have not been increased since then. And we've warded off employers' efforts to reduce the benefits, but we haven't been able to increase it. One of the problems we have here is, at least in theory, there are some people think that it takes a 2/3 majority to pass a bill. I'm not positive about that, because we pass increases in disability insurance taxes without a 2/3 majority. They're totally funded by the workers, and UI is totally funded by employers here. So it's a real mess, and I think California is probably, you know, one of the worst examples. We still have the Cobalt system. It's never been fixed. They've just tried to patch it, and it's never worked. We've had, I don't know, the fraud has been massive, at least $11 billion, probably more. And the problem now in the legislature is that they're only focusing on the technological problems in the system. They're not dealing with financing. They're not dealing with benefit inadequacy. Luckily, we have pretty good access here in California to benefits, but it could be improved. Anyway, I just don't see it really being fixed at the state level. Maybe in some states, and I think we have a state north of us, Washington, which has a tremendous system and has actually cut the taxes for employers and increased benefits at the same time during the pandemic. So that's a state that's worth looking at. But I think unless we can somehow develop a big campaign, it's going to take a lot of heavy political lifting to do anything on this.
Absolutely. I don't disagree with you. I think that's a really good flag, and glad to hear you support full federalization. I know June also had a comment or question, or was there a particular question, Tom, that you wanted me to kind of respond to, or us to respond to?
Yeah, for you. I mean, do you have people working in California? Because it'd be great to be in contact with you.
Yeah, we have a lot of, so CPD has been doing a lot of work with various kind of affiliate organizations that we've been supporting. We've been supportive of also kind of state state activists of different kinds, whether members of particular union locals or leadership of particular union locals in certain states who are interested in UI reform. We've been supportive of and try to provide whatever support we're able to, whether that's kind of some policy information or mobilizing our local affiliates. And just for folks' understanding, Center for Popular Democracy is a network kind of umbrella organization with a lot of different affiliates around the country, such as ACE in Northern California, I know of is a major community organization in California, but I know they haven't, ACE, for example, has not been as focused on the unemployment fight, but we do have a lot of kind of unemployed action as a project, has a couple thousand Californians I know who we're in the process of helping mobilize and get them more involved, either through directly trying to put pressure on federal advocates. But I know kind of on the federal point, it's going to be a lot of heavy lifting in a major campaign that we are kind of suiting up for and building a coalition, that is not just kind of community organizations, but also includes labor and various progressive groups and whoever else we can find who's willing to kind of throw down on the issue. But it's one that I think we're very determined to figure out, because I don't think there's going to be another moment like this in a while, historically, to be able to highlight the need to fundamentally reform unemployment insurance system. And I know Catherine, for example, has written an op-ed, if I'm correct, in the Washington Post, actually, about the antiquated nature of the UI system. So I just wanted to say, I thank you for your writing, your work. But I also know June had a question, but Catherine, I know you had a comment or question. So feel free to kind of jump in.
Yeah, June, you go first.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. I like your picture of Frances Perkins in the background. That tells me a lot. I'm June Hopkins. I'm a historian. I live in Washington State. I'm a retired academic, and my field was mostly 20th century and the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration. So this is really interesting for me, and I was really happy to hear Lois and Courtney's take on this. As far as I think, the term working poor should not be existing in this United States. There should not be that term. When the Social Security Act was passed and unemployment insurance was part of it, they didn't pay attention to this idea of gig workers or self-employed. It was the idea of, in this era of vast unemployment, it was, how do we protect the employed? The idea that agricultural workers and domestic workers were not included was temporary, and was mostly because Henry Morgenthau thought it would be too difficult to collect the money from them. But that changed. But what I would be interested in what Courtney and Lois, what would you think would be the solutions? And I have to agree that federalization is something that really has to happen. There has to be some kind of continuity between and among states, some equality. And certainly, as I was listening to these two very smart women talking, it's not just people of color, it's women who have been disenfranchised and have not been able to participate equally in the benefits that Roosevelt wanted to give to all of American citizens. So other than the fact that this should be federalized, for gig workers and self-employed, how do you manage unemployment?
Well, I think first of all, we need to really deal with all of the isms in normal hiring to begin with. Because most people I know in my field, and just in general, most people that I know that are gig workers because they were racistly excluded, or they were excluded because they're women and they're older. We need to get rid of all of that to begin with. Secondly, I think that we need to have the same standards for us that we have for people that are working a job. So if you work 6 months and then you don't have work, you should be able to submit what you were making and be eligible for unemployment. It shouldn't be so tied to you having somebody else as your employer. Or, in my case, like, for example, I would have had to have had my clients claim me as an employer, and that's a problem for them tax-wise. So nobody ever wanted to do that. So that kind of needs to not be the situation for the self-employed. If they can prove that they were working for 6 months, then, and even if they got monthly checks instead of weekly checks, whatever, however they were paid, we need to be able to, after 6 months, if we're not working, be able to apply just like everybody else.
And
But would the federal government be stepping in as your employer and pay you unemployment insurance when you didn't have a client and you weren't able to get a gig?
Yeah, I would say either the federal or the state. So, you know, because in New York, there's just like millions of gig workers now.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see your point. I think Lois had something to, I didn't want to interrupt Lois.
I think it's a shame that our society does not value all workers. It seems to me that only professional white collar workers are valued, and not say domestic help or people working in fast food or wait staff as restaurants, or even caretakers of the disabled. And that's a shame, because those people work very, very, very hard, and without them, our society couldn't function. I have a disabled brother who lives in a group home, and he relies on direct care staff to take care of him, and without them or without me, you know, he wouldn't survive. And it's just sickening to me that football players and basketball players make millions of dollars a year to play a game, and I understand that they work hard and they've developed their skills and they have talents, but at the same time, playing basketball isn't as important as taking care of people like my brother or my now elderly mother, who has someone come in a couple of times a week to help her.
June, you have to, yeah.
I got it. That's really heartwarming as well as frightening, that these essential workers are not admired by the federal government for giving them some kind of subsidy. But the question is, would a government subsidy, the way we're getting these checks now, you know, these subsidized checks from the federal government, would that be a solution, or would the fact that restructuring the way people get jobs and hold jobs and are treated as unemployed, that would take a major restructuring of government policy toward work, just basically toward work itself? That would be a huge undertaking, but
we're going to have to do it, because now we're going to have to have a major restructuring, because it's already restructuring itself. I mean, you look at how many people are gig workers right now, or freelancers. You know,
and we're also,
so we can't not restructure it, because it's going to also be a problem when it comes to Social Security and all of these other programs, when we have millions upon millions of people that are not working in the old traditional, you know, 40 hours a week, go into an office and that whole thing. So we got to figure that, we're going to have to figure this out.
That way of life is dying out, I think.
It's dead already. I mean, it's not dying, it's already dead. And our system is not set up to address it. And so again, I think that was the one of the good things that came out of the pandemic, was that we actually looked at unemployment in a different way, which was really surprising. Because like I said, I didn't know what I was going to do, because I knew I couldn't get clients. My clients are all small businesses. Probably a lot of them went under themselves, let alone be able to pay me a couple thousand a month. That, you know, they're just not, I knew they weren't going to be able to do it.
And this reminds me that for people who are working, and for when most of us do go back to work, the minimum wage is going to need to be increased to at least $15 an hour. There's talk to raise it slowly over the next few years, but in my opinion, $15 an hour, if you live in New York City or places like California, that's not going to be enough, but it's a start. And so we really do need to fix UI as well as raise the wage. And there are politicians, especially in the red states, that are trying to gerrymander and engage in voter suppression, and we need to fight that too, because you know, this is all tied together. If people can't vote, or if their votes are not counted, then it's just going to be that much harder to enact changes in the UI system and raise the minimum wage.
Mhm. That's a great point, Lois. And thank you, Lois, and thank you, June, for bringing up those points. I want to invite Catherine to kind of bring up her comment or question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And June, I'm glad you liked Madam Perkins behind me. I converted my bedroom closet to an office for the pandemic, and she just keeps me company, so I'm not alone in here. So you know, Francisco, I had a couple questions to, you know, from a policy expert's perspective.
Yeah.
You know, one of the probably the two biggest sticking points for federalization, or for UI reform rather, is that you know, one, I think federalization is the answer that makes sense for efficiency in provision of benefits for workers. But the real sticking point is financing. So at the moment, it's financed by, benefits are financed by a tax on workers' wages that the employer pays.
Yeah.
And the tax is very poorly incentivized. To move to a federal program, you know, a lot of people would tell you that you'd have to move to changing the statutory incidence of the tax to have it be a worker, if not a split worker employer tax, a full worker tax.
Yeah.
Have you heard from, you know, the you know, workers like Lois and Courtney, you know, these kind of like nuanced tax questions can be end up being a sticking point in reform. And I'm wondering if you know, how would people feel about, you know, moving from benefits that would come out of their own paycheck instead of out of their employer's pocket?
I mean, there is I don't want to speak for Lois and Courtney. I know Lois and I have been a part of some conversations with a group of other unemployed workers who have kind of talked about, who have brought up the idea that even a small tax, employee side tax, wouldn't be totally out of the question, in part because it does create, from our impression, is it does create a level of buy-in that doesn't necessarily exist. As a Pennsylvania resident, I know it creates a level of buy-in every time I look at one of my pay stubs. I know that I'm directly paying into this process. I also know it is highly inefficient, and that is kind of a point of contention. Those nuanced tax questions of precisely how you do it, I think, it hasn't been necessarily something we've dived super deeply on, because they get kind of complicated, like the precise mechanisms and precise incentives of different types of experience rating. For example, I know Alaska has a tax system that might be a model for a potential federal form of financing that might mitigate some of the bad incentives involved. That said, you know, I don't think I am personally not against employee side taxes. I think Lois brings up a really great point about, if we were to do it, we'd want to see potentially something progressive, so that there is so there's some level of progressivity and not such a high burden on workers. But if you were to say like, but it could also open up the door quite realistically for self-employed workers and small business owners to also be paying into the UI system.
So there's the thought that if you make this a worker paid, that if you change the statutory incidence, it gives an easier way to incorporate self-employed into the system through quarterly tax filings that they would pay, through Social Security wages. And so this would be a way to incorporate them, what you could do on the employer side is just thinking of kind of like most efficient ways to incorporate into the system. And, and like Social Security, the tax system is regressive and the benefit system is progressive. And that is how social insurance programs can fall.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Yeah, no, the paying taxes more frequently if you're self-employed and paying more taxes if you're a worker, might be the kind of birth for a federal program, but it's a nuanced point, and I'm curious how y'all's conversation has gone around that, and so on. And I guess that was kind of the question. But I stopped talking, but it's kind of a question.
It's a great question. It's a question where I think we're thinking a lot about the benefits and delivery and administration first, because that is often kind of how people are going to be thinking about it on the ground. And as as organizers, we're thinking constantly, how do we mobilize folks so that they have buy-in into a system that, and like, of course, the financing is going to be critical because it's going to affect the different interest groups who ultimately play out. And I think Tom probably has a comment related to this. So I'd love to hear his perspective a little bit too.
Yeah, well, I personally, not taking a position for organized labor, but personally, I think some worker funding is basically a good idea. Social Security is that way, so people feel more of a stake in Social Security and also are listened to more. In California, we've had a state disability insurance since Earl Warren in 1946, and this funds paid leave for people who are sick or who have to take care of sick family members. It also was expanded to cover paid family leave for newborns. Anyway, it is fully funded by workers. It's much more progressively funded than the UI system, and labor basically has control of it because the legislature doesn't listen to the employers very much when they come. They oppose paid family leave, and the way we ended up getting it was originally it was supposed to be funded by both employers and workers. The employers went crazy about it. When we eliminated the employer funding and actually cut the number of weeks from it was originally 12 down to 6, the bill got through without any trouble. So the worker funding, at least in part, in like Social Security, I think is something you really should look at. And I think if the system were properly constructed and was seen as a more equitable and a fair system and helped low-income workers and eliminated the racist elements, I think you could get labor support for that. Part of the issue with labor is labor hasn't paid much attention to UI for a long time. I looked at, because I know that NASI has a working group on this. You might be on it. But there's a guy from the AFL-CIO on it. So I was in touch with their people who work on this. They haven't taken a policy position on unemployment insurance since I don't know when. They used to have a department that had someone there who brought the state federation people together and talked about workers' comp and UI. That department was eliminated, long ago. So they have not taken a lead on this issue, and hopefully the results of this pandemic, one of the results will be that they pay more attention to it.
Actually, really briefly on this, and then I'll quickly let Lois kind of have the last word. I want to highlight, though, that there are some exciting policy ideas out there, like getting labor on board as like navigators, or subsidizing, giving grants and money
Yeah.
to labor to function as navigators, to get them to potentially in some sort of bill. If we get it through, obviously we'd have to work through the financing, and I think this is something I would love to connect with Catherine on. But just thinking through, if there's a way to do reemployment, to get labor involved in reemployment or training or apprenticeships and subsidize that, there are ways to also further build in the interests of labor into a bill and get them more on board, especially if it helps do a lot of the things, to organize not just employed workers, but unemployed workers across numerous sectors across the economy. But I really want to, that's a great point to highlight. Thank you, Tom. I just want to quickly hand it to Lois, and I think we're probably wrapping up soon, Griffin, if I'm right.
I just wanted to say that with all the millionaires and billionaires out there, it's really frustrating to me that we have to beg for money, not just unemployed people, but people who are disabled or the elderly. I know money doesn't grow on trees, but there's just so much of it out there, and it seems like most people, even if they work very hard, aren't going to have access to it. And so we do need to fix the UI system, and we do need to raise the minimum wage. And I think it's a matter of educating the public with public service announcements. And I don't know how to tax the rich, because obviously they won't go for that, but I think that's something that needs to happen. I don't know how to make it happen. Yeah, I just get frustrated with all this money that's out there, not just in America, but in the world as a whole. There's still so many people living in dire poverty through no fault of their own, and that's just awful.
And then I wanted
Yeah.
to add to what Lois is saying there is, I think one of the things with that, Lois, is we also have to get rid of two things. We have to get rid of racism, and we also have to get rid of people embedded with the American dream. Because you get even the brokest person doesn't want somebody else to have these benefits, and they sit there and talk about, oh, it's the deficit. You get these people living in trailers talking about a deficit, like that's really going to affect them in some way. And that's been able to be used on people. And they're like, I don't want to pay tax dollars for Shaniqua and her 5 babies. You get that kind of nonsense going on,
Right.
and they don't recognize that it's hurting them themselves. So,
and I don't think they want benefits even for themselves.
well, they do, but they almost don't want someone else to have them more than they want them even for themselves. And we have to get rid of that concept, because I saw that a lot in some of the unemployment groups, where people were really pissed off that people were getting unemployment that were freelance workers or self-employed. And they felt like, there was one woman going on about how her next door neighbor's daughter shouldn't get them. And so that kind of thing we have to get rid of, so that we can build a movement where people see these things are good for everyone.
Right. And I think that gets, Francisco,
I
please.
think that's a great note to end on.
Absolutely.
About how we're going to make a truly universal UI system and what it's going to take. But thank you, Courtney, Lois, and Griffin, and everyone in Nasi for the opportunity to speak with all of you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lois, Courtney, Francisco. Catherine, go for it.
Oh yeah, no, I was gonna offer to say that if you wanted to get together and talk about some of the tax stuff, that's can be really just trudgy to get through. I'm happy to come by, but get together on tax policy issues with the center if you're at all interested. The other thing I was going to say, and this is such a horrible note to end on relative to Courtney's brilliant point, but I would not call out COBOL as the programming language, because I would bet that everybody on this call has a bank that is still using COBOL. It's really common in the financial sector. It's the language itself is really old because it was built because of when it was built. The problem with the state UI systems is not the language, it's that they don't have anyone on staff that knows it. And they haven't had anyone on staff who's known it for like 15 years. So like they don't know how to program changes to their benefit system for that reason. And so when the state was like, we need the COBOL cowboys to come in, it wasn't that the programming language was old. It was really just that they had invested so little in staff and administration that they didn't even know their own system. Whereas like your bank has COBOL and it's keeping your money safe, but they also like very much guard that IT infrastructure, and they've built onto it to modernize it. So rather than replace COBOL with another language, they've just kind of like kept that part intact and then built it into their more modern system. And so I know
that's a great point.
Yeah, I don't ever want you to get into the point where like you bring up that they use COBOL and some person like uses it as a chance to say like you don't, you know, because people are so mean. Like if you say one thing factually wrong, you're not right about anything.
No, it's a good point, because I think there's been modernized systems that are still not delivering benefits today, and that's not necessarily COBOL's fault.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, granted, it is a really quirky language. If you know computer programming languages like I do, and you see COBOL, you're like, our money is not safe. But it's very quirky. But the administrative aspect, I mean, it's a two-way problem. One is that states don't invest in it, and if they do, they really like they throw money at a problem and then they really don't fix it. But the second part is they have no oversight. I mean, the federal, oh, nice to see you, Lois. The Federal Department of Labor, I don't know if they've ever seen an unemployment insurance claim.
Yeah.
They don't make claims. They don't collect claims. They don't see claims. They see a weekly report of totals that have a note attached to them from the state, should they like to. So it's hard to say like what would drive administrative reforms without additional accountability.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How long have you been working in this area?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Since I was hired back in July.
Baptism by fire into the wonderful world.
I have become, talk to me about Ghent systems and I'll probably be a lot more, even more much more literate, but
Yeah,
You've learned a lot.
trying to. I think
Totally.
I've been learning a lot with a lot of the workers that we've been lucky to organize and work with. So
yeah, well, I think one thing I
Catherine,
want to
what do you-
highlight.
Catherine, what did you
Sorry to
do?
cut you off, Courtney. I just want to give people the chance to sign off, and then we can continue.
Okay.
To the people who are just observing, thank you so much for joining. Thank you to Francisco, Courtney, and Lovis so much for sharing your stories that are so important to be heard. And to Catherine, to Tom, and to June for participating and